Good afternoon, hello, and welcome to the 16th Indonesian Regional Science IRSA Keynote Address. My name is Sekar Utami. I'm an assistant professor and a researcher at the Department of Economics, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and I will be your moderator today. In this keynote address session, we will have Professor Kunal Sen from the University of Manchester. But before we give the floor to him, I would like to introduce Professor Sen briefly. Well, a little bit. It's not brief actually because he has such a long CV, but I'm just gonna try to make it brief. So Professor Sen has over 3 decades of experience in academic and applied development economic research. He's an author of 8 books and editor of 5 volumes on economics and political economy of development. From 2019, he is the director of UNU WIDER, that is United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, and he's a professor of development economics at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. So he's a leading international expert on the political economy of growth and development, and he has performed extensive research on international finance, political economic determinants, and the dynamics of poverty, social exclusion, and so on and so forth. And in addition to his work as a professor, Professor Sen has been a joint research director of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center. He has been awarded the Sanjay Lal Prize in 2006 and the Dudley Series Prize in 2003 for his publication. So without further ado, Professor Sen, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to speak at the 16th IRSA International Conference. Let me first share my screen so that I can put my slides up. So I hope you can see my slides. And what I'm going to speak about today is essentially about a project that we are conducting in United Nations University, the World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNE WIDER in short. It has other partners such as IBS Warsaw and also DPRU, University of Cape Town. So I'll speak about this project about for 45 minutes and then there'll be a little bit time for question and answer. So to give you a little bit of background behind why we did this project, which is now in its final stages, is that, and this is very obvious for most of you, especially Indonesia itself has exactly seen this. There's been an increase in inequality in many countries, been a lot of debate about it. Why exactly do we see this? And what are the drivers? What are the implications? And of course, a lot of the literature has looked at the top 1%, the richest 1% of the distribution in incomes. And that's probably right because we see a lot of inequality increasing because of exactly the richest 1% are becoming even more richer. But also, of course, that's not the only thing, important issue about inequality, especially on earnings inequality, because the other 99% of the population obviously needs to be also taken into account, where actually in that group, labor earnings is the most important source of income, more than capital income. For the top 1%, obviously capital income it's very important. And so what exactly they're going to earn in the distribution itself, depending on where you are in the distribution, is going to determine your relative income position. And even though we know that governments can do something about earnings inequality by using tax-based redistributive policies, but there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's a lot of inequality in the labor market, whatever the government can do by taxing the richer workers and then providing some kind of benefits of cash transfers to the poorer workers, there's a limit to what you can do. So at the end of the day, we need to understand why do we see, if at all, very strong earnings inequality in the labor market. And that's exactly the motivation behind this project. So what determines earning inequality? Now, earnings inequality, as many of you know who've been working on this area, there's a long literature on this. This is where labor economists have been working for many, many years. And the literature on this, the previous literature, which is a very long-standing literature, talks about what is called skill-biased technological change, SBTC in short. And there's very rich literature on this for Western countries, advanced countries, but also now for developing countries. And what this literature argues is that skill-biased technological change increases the marginal productivity of skilled labor relative to that of unskilled labor. So, if you're skilled, your education, you're college educated, your returns to your college education is going to increase more than somebody who doesn't have a college education, somebody who's got a high school education, or even not even a high school education. So what does it does is it increases the relative demand for skilled labor for those who are college educated versus those who are high school educated, not educated very much, and consequently the wage premium on skilled labor. So it increases inequality across workers of different skills because it increases demand for those with skills. And here skills essentially measured by looking at your education levels. So that's very straightforward here. But in more recent times, there's been a very exciting literature on what is called the task-based approach. And many labor economists have been taking a more nuanced view of skill-biased technological change. There's this thing that skill-biased technological change does not necessarily lead to depressed demand for all low-skilled workers. And that's an important difference. But for workers involved in routine tasks that can now be executed with computer technologies. So it's not that all low-skilled workers are going to be essentially hurt by technological change, but those who are working in tasks that can be essentially automated away. So that's the intuition there. So these workers are not necessarily the lowest skilled, they may not be, and they're more likely to be the middle skilled part of the occupational distribution, like production work, factory workers, for example, or clerical workers, for example. Others are two very good examples, where more and more automation means that you're actually losing your job because of computers coming in to take your job, or some other way that automation can affect the demand for the kind of skill that you have. So at the same time, there may be higher demand for workers whose tasks are complementary to computerization, which are workers working in occupations where cognitive skills are required. Since machines can't do everything, or at least till now they can't, there are some kind of jobs where machines need to work with people, workers with particular kind of skills, which are cognitive skills. And I'll speak a little bit more about this in a minute. So this is the literature talks about this. Acemoglu has a nice paper on this with Restrepo and many others. And this particular view of technological change puts occupations at the forefront of the inequality debate, which wasn't the case before. So occupational change, moving away from routine tasks to less routine tasks, now becomes a very important part of the discussion on inequality. And that's why in this literature, occupation, we have to measure essentially, to look at occupational change and look at inequality at the occupational level to understand what's happening to overall earnings inequality. And again, so Jeffrey and others have several papers on this. So this kind of literature is called routine-biased technological change to differentiate itself away from skill-biased technological change. Here, the argument is that technology change is biased against routines and routine tasks. And essentially, we have technology change that is removing the need for routine tasks and increasing the need for the demand for non-routine tasks or cognitive tasks. So that's what the literature talks about. And just to make this clear for many of you who are probably not familiar with this literature, this very nice table that was there in the original papers, part of the path-breaking papers on this topic, with David Otter, the very famous labor economist in the US and others, makes this very clear. And so this is a simple, I'll not go through everything in the table, but just give the intuition. So imagine there are tasks which are routine and there are tasks not routine. And in that, then there are tasks which are analytical and interactive tasks and tasks which are manual tasks. So routine tasks which are analytical are record keeping, calculation, repetitive customer service like the bank teller. And in this kind of task, there's substantial substitution, computers making a difference. But this kind of task, you don't need human beings, perhaps. You don't need humans with the same skills anymore. And so essentially what's going on is computers are taking away, so to speak, this kind of occupation which involve routine tasks. Now, on the other side, non-routine tasks, which are analytical, they are where you need human ingenuity and cognitive skills. Forming, testing hypotheses as economists, we keep on doing that. I don't really think a computer as yet can still do that, but we don't know with artificial intelligence. Medical diagnosis, legal writing, persuading, selling things to others, managing others. There, you can't expect computerization to do this task. And in fact, you need to have human beings working with computers to actually to be in the production process. And therefore, the strong complementarities between this task and computerization. So then it's very interesting. So at one level, we have substitution, computers taking over human beings' occupation tasks that human beings were otherwise doing, and others are strong complementarities. Then you need to move to the next level, manual tasks, and this is pretty obvious, like picking or sorting, repetitive assembly. These are very, very manual tasks, and we see a lot of that in developing countries, of course. There again, there's substantial possible substitution, because this kind of task, increasingly we see machines doing it. If you think about what's happening in agriculture and farming in the US, a lot of machines are doing or are doing exactly what before human beings used to do, labor used to do. So those are, again, possibility of substantial substitution. And then we have manual tasks which are non-routine, like janitorial services, cleaning, office buildings, truck driving. So this is where there's limited opportunities as yet, for substitution or complementarity. I mean, I'm saying as yet because we know already we're talking about driverless cars, right? And we already hear now about trucks being driven by without human beings as drivers. So, even this itself might change in the next 10 to 20 years. We don't know. So this is a very nice way to think about it. Routine tasks, non-routine tasks, analytical tasks, manual tasks. And we have this 2 by 2, which gives us quite strong hypothesis to test about how computerization can affect occupations and tasks which are linked to these occupations. So that's a very nice way to think about this particular approach, the task-based approach. So what does it mean for empirical analysis? So with computerization, we get diminished demand for routine tasks, whether manual or analytic. That was clear from the previous table. In contrast, we get increased demand for analytical, non-routine tasks with no discernible effect on non-routine manual tasks. So we'll see a decreased demand for routine tasks, which are either analytical or manual. And at the same time, we increased demand for analytical, non-routine tasks, cognitive with need cognitive skills, and no specific effect on non-routine manual tasks, like, for example, personal care and so on, cleaning and so on. We don't really expect any big effect of computerization. This would imply a hollowing out the middle skill jobs as compared to low and high skill jobs. And that's an important difference in this literature and the earlier literature on skill-based technology change. And a stark prediction of this task model is that occupational structure shifts, there will increase wage polarization in the labor market. In other words, we'll see a situation where at the middle of the distribution, we'll see wages decline, but wages will increase at the top end of the distribution, and maybe not even, and maybe there'll be no big effect at the bottom of the distribution, or maybe even a small increase. So we know this is why we talk about wage polarization and employment polarization because of this, of task-based, of routine-based technological change. Now, of course, the work of David Otter has been fundamental in this area. I should just give a plug that we have this conference coming up in September, the Jobs and Development Conference, which I think anybody can register for this conference. That David Otter will be giving one of the keynote lectures, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. And I certainly suggest you should also listen in, given his knowledge, given what his work he's done in this area. So Otter put some very nice graphs in a recent lecture he gave at the American Economic Association, and you can see exactly the problem that's happening in the US, for example. So what we're seeing is that those who are college educated, this is the darkish degree line here, graduate degrees or bachelor's degree, you can see the increase has happened in their real weekly earnings over the period 1960 to 2017. That's like pretty much 60 years now. And so you can see this big increase, while those who do not have college education, high school dropouts, high school graduates, some college, you can see a flattening. But not much change really. No, in fact, if anything, there's been a decrease in this group, the high school dropouts. Okay, and interestingly, even for women, you see a very similar pattern. Right? So this is not to do with gender differences. You can see, though we know women are in particular kinds of occupations than men, but we can also see similar trends here that those who are college educated and of some kind of college bachelor's degree or graduate degree are doing much better than women who are high school dropouts or are high school graduates and don't have college education. So you can see that. Now, also increasingly, so this is a very interesting graph we showed of earnings, but on occupation, we see similar sorts of situations, similar kind of patterns. We can see that those who are in this lower end of the occupation, health and personal services, cleaning, and all of these things, which are at the lowest level in terms of earnings, we see an increase in that occupation. So an increase in demand for those kind of occupations. Those are the production workers, factory workers, and those who are office admin. We can see a big decline in the number of workers in this kind of occupation in the US. And as I said, of the polarization hypothesis, those who are technicians, professional managers, we can see a large increase. And this is exactly the polarization argument, that here we see an increase, here we see an increase, and here we see an increase. Okay. Now, of course, this is about the US, and this has also been observed for the UK and other richer countries. But what about developing countries? So, is this should have any relevance to developing countries? No. I mean, these countries are really at the far, away from the technological frontier. Many of these countries don't have popularization, don't have automation. It's not really relevant for them. On the other hand, you might say, yes, it is, because we see this rapid spread of ICT, and actually, especially now in the pandemic period, and outsourcing of tasks in developing countries is happening quite a bit. So with the global production networks, global value chains, we see increasingly tasks that were initially done in the US and the UK and other richer countries moving to developing countries. For example, the World Development Report of the World Bank last year says that the fragmentation of goods production has been associated with the outsourcing of not just manufacturing tasks, but also services tasks. The back office in many US manufacturers now in India, as an example. So in the argument would be, yes, this is relevant because you're already seeing this happening in many different countries because of integration, because of globalization. And so ultimately, it's an empirical question. Do we expect the routine-based technological change argument, which is clearly evident in the richer countries in its effects on inequality, having an implication, having an effect in developing countries? And that's exactly because of this empirical question, we felt that we needed to look at it systematically using country case studies and countries from very different parts of the global south. So we launched a project in 2019 called The Changing Nature of Work and Inequality, where we essentially wanted to do an in-depth analysis of the trends in earnings inequality in 11 major developing countries and emerging economies located to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And there's a project web page where you can find more information about this project. So I encourage you to go and take a look at the web page on our website. All right. So what are the main core questions? The core questions here are that what are the main first question? What are the main drivers of trends in earnings inequality in different countries and regions in the global south? First question. Second, how does the nature of earnings inequality in developing countries differ from the experience of developed countries? So what we saw, what David Otter has found in the US, do we see that for countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America? And is the changing nature of work making labor market more polarized or unequal in the global south, as they seem to have done in the global north? So these are really important questions. And to address these questions, we got together a team of very, very capable economists based in the global south from 11 countries. And I'm just going to very quickly read about the country names. Latin America, we had Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Africa, which includes North Africa, we had Ghana, South Africa, and Tunisia. Asia, which is both South and East Asia, includes Bangladesh, China, India, and Indonesia. So 11 countries. And we had very capable labor economists involved in this, including Professor Arif Yusuf from Indonesia. And so then, so the project's contribution is, in my view, quite important, because one of the things we were very clear about, we said that to get an answer to the questions that we posed, we have to do it in a very systematic way. In other words, we can't compare apples and oranges. We've got to compare like for like, apples with apples. And so, in a way, what we try to do is that we try to look at the national trends in earnings inequality using country experts and assess them against changes in the supply of higher skilled workers, the education premium, the skill bias technology change argument, and change in the occupational structure, the remuneration of tasks, the routine bias technology argument, and of course, looking at the broader macroeconomic trend and institutional development. Each country has specific institutional arrangements, minimum wage regulations, and so on and so forth. So obviously, we've got to keep that in mind also, not just think of everything in terms of skill bias technological change or routine bias technological change. And the first part of the project was very time intensive, extremely laborious, but I think we did something very important here. So what we did was, just because we wanted to compare like for like, we harmonized national occupational codes to the International Standard Classification of Occupations, ISCO 88. ISCO 88 is what we used as a common classification of occupation. Now, if any of you are working with labor market data, it's not easy because each country has its own specific national occupation code. So if you map it from your own country's national occupation code to the ISCO code, it often needs some thinking on your part, cognitive skills actually. We've got to think through, okay, this particular occupation, how is it mapped to something that I see, observe in ISO 88? So that was took some time, but I do think it was done very carefully with all country authors so that we were fairly confident by the end of this process, we were able to compare line for line. So I think that was really important. Also, after we did this, after we got a common set of occupational coding across countries using ISO 88, we adopted a common methodological framework to investigate trends in inequality within different countries. So we told all the country authors got to have the same methodology. You can do some things, you can use the methodology in your own way for specific things that you're interested in, but also make sure that you do the basic stuff that you want to do because we have to compare across countries and we have to have the same methodology to do that. So they did that. And I think that's again a highlight of this particular project. And we can see the papers that are pretty much, most of them now are published on the web page for this project. So you will provide a unique comparative assessment, unique because nobody else, no other, as far as we know, no one else has done this. Comparative because we could compare like for like, because we could take all the occupational codes in different countries to the same occupational code, that is the international one, the ISO 88, and then use the same methodology. So we could do some things which is pretty ambitious, but it took some time, but we felt by doing so, we were to provide a major contribution to the literature that we are looking at. Now, I'm going to now give you a kind of flavor because I'm quite aware that I can't summarize 11 country studies here. That's a mistake. I'm sorry that the title of the presentation says I would, but that's really impossible given the time constraints. So I will really focus on 4 countries because I felt like just to give you a flavor of the results is much more important. So I'm going to look at 4 countries, 1 Latin American country, 1 African country, 1 Middle East, North African country. So 1 is Sub-Saharan Africa, is Ghana, North Africa, Tunisia, and 1 Asian country, India. So I'm going to just summarize the results there. And because they give a flavor of what we're getting for other countries also. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind when we look at the trend in inequality, that while in the US and elsewhere in the richer countries, there seems to be increasing inequality, earnings inequality. It's not so obvious for developing countries. And they have differed across time. Argentina saw a fall in earnings inequality in the first half of the 2010, first decade of the 2000s, but saw a rise in the earnings inequality from 2010 onwards to 2015, 2010, 13, 2015, 19. So, so we see a difference across time for Argentina. Ghana, similarly, fall, first period, rise, second period. Tunisia actually fall for both periods. And India, stable first period and fall in the second period. So we're seeing, even in the terms of earnings equality, the answer is, do we see an increase or decrease? Well, the answer would be, well, it depends on the period you're talking about. We can't really say and can't say yes or no until you tell us which period you're interested in. So I think that's very important because we need to understand that inequality evolution differs over time for developing countries. And particularly, as we see, because in developing countries, different periods have different reasons why there may have been changes, macroeconomic factors, other things, minimum wage changes, and so on. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Now, one of the things that you notice in this graph that I have here, the Gini index, essentially first 2000, 2010, and then 2010 to 2015, you can see that essentially in the first period, we see many countries' inequality has decreased because the Gini's, the 45-degree line, saying here, somewhere here, you see the inequality has actually decreased. Except South Africa here a little bit above the 45-degree line, Indonesia and China, a little bit. But there are quite a few countries, actually quite a few are in big decrease, Chile, Brazil, Ghana, and so on. So that's interesting, Tunisia also, and so on. So even though we see the Gini is quite different across countries, some countries have very high Ginis, very unequal. South Africa, of course, we know. Brazil, of course, we know. And some countries have lower Ginis, less unequal. Bangladesh, Tunisia, Argentina, and so on. But the point here, we're not looking at a level, looking at a change over time. Now, when we look at the second period, we see more increase in inequality for countries like South Africa, Ghana, Indonesia, and China. We see more of a movement up into the Ginis. But then there are other countries, as I was not observing, which have seen decrease in earnings inequality in between 2010 and 2015, 2019. So that's also interesting. So we're seeing, again, difference across 11 countries we have. Okay, moving on. I first want to just tell you a little bit about education, because that's such a big literature on this. It's so important, especially with so many other countries where there's been a big increase in those who are getting college education these days compared to school. Even primary school now been a big increase. In many different countries, you're getting almost universal enrollment now in schools. But certainly college education also been a big increase too in many countries. And so we have seen a large increase in level of education, secondary and tertiary, in all countries. That's a fact. And that's not surprising, because these countries have gone through major transformation. These are emerging economies which are done pretty well in some respect to economic development. And at the same time, that has led to increased demand for getting college education. So that we've seen. And the increase in supply has not been often matched by increase in demand in some cases. So there's been a fall in the skill premium. So college education, yeah, we've got a college education, but who's going to employ you? So in some cases, we've seen a fall in skill premium. And you can see here, Argentina, for example, share of workers, primary education fallen as more and more workers are getting more educated. Secondary education increased, tertiary education increased in both periods. But the education premium has fallen in the first period and then an increase in the second period. And that's interesting. So even the education premium, the skill bar psychological change argument there, we're seeing differences in one country even over time. And that's, again, something to keep that in mind. Subtle change, which is around occupational change. And here we see quite a bit of change here. We've seen increase in the share of work in high-skill occupations and decline in low-skill occupations, with a rebound in most recent years, where we seem to see a rebound in low-skill occupations, which is interesting. We've seen shift of workers out of agriculture, that we know. That's such a transformation for you, for countries which are growing quite fast, at least for some periods, and especially the services. And we have seen a movement from self-employment to paid employment. This is an overall pattern we've seen after transformation across most different countries. And we've seen a shift of workers towards less routine occupations in these cognitive tasks, managers, professionals, and so on. So that's all. This is the overall sense we're getting from looking at occupational structural change. And I think it kind of confirms our sense that, yes, in these countries, there has been a movement towards more high-skilled occupations, less routine occupations, and obviously more into services, and in some countries also into manufacturing and more into paid employment. Okay. Now, what we now want to do, is to get into the literature and routine-based technology change. And I want to use a measure, because we need to find a way to measure routine-based technology change. Use a fairly intuitive measure called routine task intensity. We're going to call it RTI for short. And let me just define it for you. So the RTI measure we use has been used by one of our collaborators in this project before. And the RTI measure essentially is going to be the log of R cognitive plus R manual for each occupation. I is occupation divided by 2 minus log of NR analytical. NR is non-routine, R is routine. So R is routine, NR is non-routine. It's non-routine analytical and non-routine personal divided by 2. It's a simple intuitive measure, but it pretty much captures this thing that if you see increase in RTI, routine task intensity, tasks are getting more routine, are getting more routine. There's more task intensity in these occupations. And just to make it very clear, because this formulation is a little bit different from the table I showed you earlier from David Otter's work. So here, basically what we have is we have non-routine cognitive analytical tasks like solving problems, reading news, non-routine cognitive interpersonal tasks, like supervising others, making speeches, giving presentations, that's what I'm doing right now. Routine cognitive tasks, such as changing order of tasks, filling out forms, making speeches, not making speeches at all, and then physical tasks. So in this measure that we have, we don't have manual tasks because we could not get data on manual tasks. So we don't think it's making a difference in the calculation of RTI. So what we have is cognitive and manual, routine manual, routine cognitive, and non-routine minus non-routine, analytical non-routine personal. So you can kind of see the intuition behind that. An increase in R kind of tasks over an R kind of task is making the occupation more routine tasks, right? So that's a pretty strong, simple intuition. Now, just to give you some sense of how the RTI has moved across countries, remember the RTI increases, that means the tasks getting more routine-wise. And we can see that it's, again, it's a bit of a mix, but we see decline in country-specific RTIs. So Argentina is in a fall, Ghana is in a fall, India is in a fall, but Tunisia is in an increase. So if you look at the countries and look at what happened in each country, because of what is the reason why we get this change in RTIs, we see very different stories. And this is why the country-specific stories are very important. Argentina has seen a reduction in elementary occupations, rise in machine operators, sales and service workers, clerks, professional managers. Ghana has seen a falling employment in agriculture, manufacturing, rising services, and so on, including high-skilled workers in education and public administration. India has seen a rise in professional managers, service workers, foreign clerical workers, machine operators, and elementary workers have also increased, especially in construction. Tunisia has seen a higher demand for elementary workers in the 2000s and for skilled and agriculture and productive service workers in the 2010s, which might explain why RTI has increased in Tunisia. So country-specific experience is very important. Each country is in its own way quite unique in the way things have happened for many reasons, historical reasons, macroeconomic factors, and so on. And so we need to keep that in mind. And this is one of the advantages of this project, that we're able to say, yeah, this happened in Indonesia or in Ghana or India, whichever country, and we can say exactly why. Why has RTI changed in these countries for various reasons? And actually, the rise in RTI is also observed with Chile, Bangladesh, and China, Indonesia. So in a way, we have a mixed picture. In some countries, RTI decreased. In some countries, RTI increased. That's also quite interesting. Okay. Now, what about the evidence of polarization in employment? Well, again, very mixed evidence and weak evidence, actually. So we don't really see what we've seen in the US. So we see a U-shaped kind of curve, so that, basically occupations are moving to occupation is happening, so that the occupation at the bottom of the top distribution are increasing. The one in the middle is falling, and that's what we saw in the US with David Otto's graph. Well, we see some of that in Bangladesh, China, Indonesia in 2000s, Peru, India in 2010. But then we also see inverted U-shape for Brazil, Peru in the 2000s, Bangladesh in 2010s. And we see a positive linear trend in Ghana in 2000s. So in many cases, there's no significant relationship. But what do I mean by that? If I regress the log employment share on log wage in the previous period and square the log wage to capture the U-shaped nature of this relationship, the possible U-shaped nature of the relationship, in India, for example, we see a negative coefficient for log wage and a positive coefficient of square of log wage, and both are significant. So we do see in India U-shaped relationship, which is where the relationship is significant. But that's not the case in many other countries. So again, something that to keep in mind, the polarization findings are quite mixed across countries, even over periods, and that's something one has to be careful about in inferring anything that we see in the US or UK or elsewhere for a developing country context. So that's important. Earnings, very similar story here. We can see again mixed evidence here. I will not read to the whole slide here, but what we again see is a very mixed evidence. Again, taking examples from two countries, India. Now we regress log mean earnings on log wage last period in the square of log wage. We see a positive coefficient for log wage and a significant positive coefficient for log wage, and a negative and significant coefficient for square of log wage. In other words, here we see an inverted U on earnings polarization, inverted U, right? So that's again very interesting, but that's not what we saw in the US, for example. Argentina is just opposite. Argentina actually, especially in the second period, in the second period actually, we see a negative coefficient, significant coefficient on log wage, and a positive and significant coefficient for square of log wage. So now in Argentina, we have inverted U shape. So what we're really seeing is this very interesting differences across countries of polarization, very interesting differences, both across countries, also, as I said, over periods. And that's, again, something we're finding is quite striking in our project. Okay, so what is the role of utilization in changes in employment earnings? We don't really find a big, strong role for routine task intensity or the importance of routine bias technological change. In employment, we see RTA insignificant in most cases. Again, we see U-shaped pattern in Indonesia in the 2000s, in India in 2010s, inverted U-shape in Chile in 2000s. Earnings, we see U-shape only in South Africa only in the 2010s. Positive relationship in India and Bangladesh in 2000s, and Chile and Tunisia the entire period. And again, in India in 2010, it's the inverted U. So again, on the question of RTI and this effects on employment and wage polarization, we see a very mixed picture, very mixed picture. And that's, again, I think, quite interesting, quite important. Okay, now I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I'm just wondering whether I want to go through, because I'm now going to present some results from a methodological framework. But let me just present this graph, and I may skip one or two graphs in between. So here, what we have is that we're now going to do some decomposition. This is standard in labor economics. Anybody, any of you who do labor economics know that's like our bread and butter. You have to do decompositions, right? That's the way we understand. It's a descriptive approach, but it's a very useful descriptive approach. So here, what we want to do is we want to say, okay, how much of the inequality in Gini, measured in the Gini index, a very common measure, how much can that be attributed between occupation or change, or within occupational change? And of course, if you believe in the routine bias technological change argument, much of the inequality should be because of between occupations. There's occupational change. Some occupations are increasing in terms of workers in those occupations, and some occupations, maybe in the middle of the distribution of the occupation, the share of workers is falling. But actually, we don't seem to see that. We seem to see between occupational change not really contributing much to the change in G. If it's the within occupation is the returns to your skills, your tasks in the occupation. You're a college teacher. How much are you getting? What's your earning? And is that changing over time? So for your same occupation, same skills, same tasks, same demographic characteristics, woman, man, age, location, what exactly returns to that? And that's, so essentially we are seeing much of the change that's happened in the Gini in many of these countries is because of within occupational change. It returns to the occupation, returns to skills and tasks. That's really interesting. Now, how much of this can be essentially attributed to, as I said, to changes in employment shares and changes in earnings within occupations? And this is where we did a shaped of decomposition. And as you can see from this graph, so this previous graph here, we looked at already in the previous slide, and now we are trying to do it decomposition in between groups. And you can see that in many of these countries like Argentina, Ghana, India, and Tunisia, what has happened is the employment, much of the change has happened in the Gini has happened because of change in the mean earnings, not because of change in employment shares. Not because there's been a move away from one kind of occupation, which was paying less, to another kind of occupation, which was paying higher, for example. So the changes that happen in the Gini over time in the sub-periods we're looking at, much of it is going to be because of earnings across occupation, change in earnings across occupations, rather than employment change in occupation structure. And that's interesting finding. And that's something common across the 4 countries we're looking at here. And again, I mean, so what we seem to see, summarizing what I said earlier, is seeing a narrowing gap in average earnings across occupations. So in other words, what we're seeing in many of these countries is this equalizing effect of changes in remuneration job characteristics. So depending on which occupation you're in, it seems that there's been narrowing of earnings depending on the occupation you're in over time for many of these countries. On the other hand, the evidence on inequality effect associated with change in employment shares across occupations is more mixed. So we've seen in many countries earnings inequality decrease. The reason you're seeing the decrease in earnings inequality is because what you're being paid as a college teacher versus what you're being paid as a manager seems to be the earning differences are reducing. Rather than that, managers are higher paid, and more managers in the country versus college teachers who are less well paid. So that's a really interesting finding also from our decompositions. I'm going to, let me just talk about this. And I think I have like another 5-10 minutes. And so what I just to sort of, just going back to the RTI issue. So what we did also, we ranked jobs by average earnings and by routine task intensity to see how closely they're related. And the computer concentration index. And we see that by and large, the occupation rankings are very similar. In other words, depending on, the job is less routine task intensive, the higher paid. Jobs more routine task intensive, the lower paid. And we can see that the concentration ratios are pretty high, around 80% or so in most cases, but they have been declining over time. So this link between RTI and earnings, if you rank occupations by either RTI or by earnings, is weakening over time. And in fact, as you can see first on my slide here, what we see as they're weakening over time and the relationship is non-monotonic. In other words, it's not always the case that the least lucrative occupations are not necessarily the best paid ones. So in other words, it's quite possible sometimes that the most lucrative occupations can be paying pretty well, which is not the case that we see in the richer countries. So again, I mean, the evidence of RTI affecting what's going on in earnings inequality, it's not that strong, and it seems to be even over time getting less important, and that's interesting. Now, I'm going to very quickly present something called RIF decomposition, because I think it's a very nice way to think about inequality changes over time. And for many of you who are students or young lecturers, I think it's very useful to understand this methodology. So I'm going to really quickly go through this and give you just the methodology and then one slide on the results. So the methodology, essentially, so what we saw, just to backtrack, first we did look at just what's going on in earning inequality. We did some basic shaping decomposition, looking at the role of occupational change between and within occupations on the overall Gini. But then the question would be, okay, fine, but what's going on across the whole distribution? And can we really understand the role of RTI versus education versus something else, and explaining changes in earnings across the whole distribution? And this is where this method that came along from work by Sergio Firpo, who's also involved in our project, and our colleagues. What they do is that, and this is called RIF. RIF is recentered inference function. Recentered inference functions is that they quantify the role played by different variables explaining change in inequality at different points on the earnings distribution. Now, many of you are familiar with Oaxaca blinder. I don't need to tell you about Oaxaca blinder. I mean, if you haven't got to hear of Oaxaca blinder, then I think the first thing we need to do is read a textbook on labor economics. That's like many of us who were working on labor economics has almost grown up using Oaxaca blinder, so to speak. Still a very powerful method, but it has its problems. Because, so just to sort of say what's really good about the RIF approach, one is that unlike previous approaches, this, which provided the total change in inequality in the composition and earnings structure effect, this particular methodology allows us to look at each of the covariates, their contribution to the earnings inequality across the distribution. That's really useful. And that's exactly said. What's the role of the RTI across the distribution in each explaining earnings changes over time? Second thing is that this particular approach essentially is taking the Oaxaca blinder one big step forward. So it's essentially telling us that how we can think about the whole distribution rather than looking at average earnings. Oaxaca blinder was OLS regression was an average earnings. So we can allow them to quantify the extent to which changes in inequality over time can be attributed to changes in the distribution of workers' characteristics, which you call the composition effect, the Oaxaca blinder terminology, and changes in remuneration to these characteristics, which we call the earning structure effect. Now, this different, if you know about Oaxaca blinder, that was often called the coefficients effect. In the literature here, and RIF company, we call it the earning structure effect. It's essentially the same thing to a large extent. So just to keep that in mind. Now, so again, just to be clear, any change in inequality can be decomposed into two things. Compositional changes, because some workers are better educated or have certain kind of skills, or change have happened in the demographic feature structure of the workforce, younger workers and so on and so forth, or gender differences, versus what's happened to the same worker with the same kind of occupation, same skills, same education, same everything, in terms of returns to that particular worker. So the composition effect captures the changes in the worker's characteristics over time, and the earning structure effect captures the changes in earnings to the same characteristics over time. So this is, as I said, often Oaxaca blinder says composition and coefficients. Here we're saying composition and earning structure effects. But again, in some papers you would see composition not being used, endowments being used, endowment effect. Just to be clear to you, they're all the same, mean pretty much the same thing. Okay. Now, very quickly, I want to just take you to the one of these graphs, because I can't go to all the countries. Just because I think it's good for you to understand how this works. It's also a lesson in understanding how risk competition works, because our country also did a very good job using them. So here's the one for India: urban non-agricultural paid workers. Because in India we also have a lot of workers who are self-employed, but for which we don't have any earnings data, so we have to take them out. So only paid workers. So you're looking at two periods, 2004, 2011, and 2011, 2017. Now, in both the periods, inequality has decreased, but the composition effect is has been less important. In the first period, actually, the earnings inequality has really not changed very much in the first period. In the second period has been a big decrease in the Gini, and you can see that it has mostly been because of the earnings structure effect. So change in returns to workers' characteristics are changing has led to reduction in the Gini in earnings. And you can see that very much in the second period. Okay, so then the question is that, yeah, okay, that's fine, but what about the role of RTI in education, sex, gender, social groups? Social groups in India, of course, there are very different social groups in India. Caste structure is very different in India, for example, than many other countries. Or the role of caste being very important, and age. So if we take that into account, we can quantify that with the rift composition. And you can see that basically you see that, and let me talk with the second period, right? just focusing on one period. So you can see that, most of the other variables don't matter, but education matters. Here, education is as well. Here. And education matters by essentially actually being equalizing, because what we're seeing have been unequalizing in the case that here we see education increasing earnings of the highest paid workers, but the middle of the distribution education is decreasing their earnings. And so here we see education playing a disequalizing role in this period. Interestingly, in the earlier period, education was playing a different role, because you can see here education was increasing the earnings of the lowest paid workers. The lowest paid workers in the distribution. So here in the second period, we see education playing an unequalizing role. What about RTI? Well, RTI is actually playing an equalizing role. You can see here RTI. RTI is actually helping to increase earnings in the middle of the distribution. Interestingly, RTI doesn't seem to have much of an effect here in the top of the distribution, and not much of an effect in the bottom of the distribution. But for the middle of the distribution, RTI is increasing earnings. So here we can see education versus RTI, the two big factors that we often use to understand earnings inequality. And of course, as I said, the other factors that are here are country-specific factors. All our authors use country-specific things because each country is different in many respects, but they were not particularly important. Right? And you can see that quite clearly in the calculation. Okay, I'm going to now get to the conclusion because I've got only 5 seconds left. So essentially, what we see are earnings inequality trends being quite heterogeneous across countries. No universal trend. No universal trend. You can't say that earnings inequality increase in the global south. You can't say that. You can't even say that earnings inequality increase in Argentina. You can't say that because it differs across periods. So really important to understand that. Secondly, despite large transformation of the workforce, the role of compensatory changes by occupation and education do not seem to explain inequality trends. There's not really occupational change that has been really the driving force behind change in inequality in these countries. Third, trends in inequality up or down are primarily explained by changes in the earning structure instead. The returns to workers' characteristics. And that came through all across what I've showed you, the within versus between occupation, contribution, and then more recently, the last thing I showed, the rift composition. Fourth, traditional explaining factors of trends in earnings inequality, especially cases in education premium, remain relevant in cases studied with weak evidence of job correlation or earnings associated with routine task intensity playing a substantial role. So, in other words, the old story that we had before of education being a very important explanation of the education premium still seems to hold in most countries. And we don't seem to see a strong evidence of correlation in jobs or earnings linked to routine task intensity. Fifth, potential influence of other local factors matter, and I didn't get into that too much in this presentation. For example, minimum wages are important in some countries, so on. And that's important to keep in mind. So just to end with one final remark, that we learned a lot in this project about the role of routine bias technological change and routine task intensity. We learned a lot in this project about earnings inequality changing over time in these countries. We learned a lot about how occupational changes might have played a part in changes in earnings inequality. And we learned a lot about understanding exactly how within and between occupational change can contribute to earnings inequality, and then from our use of the rift compositions, how each factors that might explain that have contributed in different ways. An overall finding we are getting is the skill by psychological change, the so-called education premium, is the key factor explaining earnings inequality in developing countries, more than routine by psychological change. Which is telling us that, I don't want to put a policy implication slide in here, because I think it's still a bit too early. We're still trying to synthesize the research that we've done. But it just shows that education is such an important factor, where we see why earnings inequality changing over time. And that's probably telling us that maybe that's where we need to focus on getting education supply, special supply of workers in the higher skilled, higher educated workers more in the workforce, but also making sure that there are jobs waiting for them. But the other thing also here is that the routine by psychological change role is not as so obvious, but that can change. I mean, with artificial intelligence and digitalization and so on, especially with the pandemic, that can change. So it's not that they can never be important. They can. But right now, it seems that routine by psychological change is not as important in explaining earnings inequality in the global south versus skill by psychological change as compared to what we have observed in the richer countries. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Sen. I think I learned a lot from you today. And I think it's really, really interesting project that the UNU wider got, like trying to find the trend in the earning inequalities, and then you have the challenges in terms of like harmonizing the national occupational codes. I think that's quite a headache. All right, so we'll have around 10 minutes for a Q&A session. We have 2 questions already. I think maybe we should just answer the question one by one. Is that okay, Professor?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is from Mas Dalin Wardana. Hello, Mas Dalin. Thank you. Interesting talk indeed. Many argue that with such technological advance and automation that might replace workers in the future, some propose for basic income grant or universal basic income. I think this is a really interesting question. However, within the context of developing countries, this option might not really be feasible fiscal-wise. So I would like to hear more from Professor Sen. Many thanks indeed.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the first thing is that, as I said, we are nowhere near what we've seen in developed countries with routine by psychological change. There, the worry was that computers taking over people's jobs. That is what we see in the project. That's not really the case. As I said, it might happen in the future. Yeah, we don't know, but not right now. So that concern that we see in the West, that workers who are otherwise skilled are losing jobs in clerical work and production work, isn't happening as yet in the developing countries. So in that context of universal basic income is not really there. That's a clear argument for why we should have UBI. The argument would be you tax computers to provide UBI to those who are displaced by computers. So that argument is not really there. Now, there's a different argument for UBI, which I not linked to our project and not linked to this core arguments I'm making, which is that maybe it's better not to have targeting of cash transfers and so on, because targeting is a very complex issue in developing countries, and providing universal income of some level would be a good way of getting away around targeting. But that's a different argument, and that's not what I think this project is obviously is not talking about, and it shouldn't. But that's a separate set of issues around the literature of social protection. And there's also the question of how do you finance UBI. If we do feel that it should be the way, of course, we can link UBI provision to the level of GDP or GDP growth. So there are ways of doing that. But as I said, that's a different way to think of a UBI than the way it's been taught in the West. And that's important to remember.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. We have another question. This is related to the RIF decomposition. I will ask a question. If RIF decomposition is an extension of Waxaka blinder decomposition, whether it can also be done for regression-based decomposition and simultaneously done percentile share analysis. This is from Bu Asih Murwiati.
Yeah, so exactly right. I mean, it is extension of Oaxaca Blinder, probably a very sophisticated extension of Oaxaca Blinder. And I mean, I don't want to get a technicalities of RIF. That's quite complicated in this in trying to explain how the RIF does it. I would just ask you to read the paper by Sergio Firpo and co-authors, a very good intuitive explanation for this approach, and also papers on our project website. The paper in India, for example, is a very nice intuitive explanation of the RIF. And just to keep in mind, what are the thing that Oaxaca Blinder always we struggle with Oaxaca Blinder was the counterfactual. So to understand whether composition effects make a difference or the earning structure effect makes a difference, we have to have a construction of counterfactual that if workers of category A, say women workers versus male workers, women workers have the same characteristics as male workers, then what is the difference in earnings, if there is a difference? The counterfactual is always a problem. And the counterfactual is a big issue that happens in the Oaxaca Blinder literature, right? Here, the way they do it is through reweighting, the RIF approach. So that's one thing, and that's exactly the contribution by Sergio Firpo and co-authors, the reweighting function. The other thing I think that what I like about RIF composition is exactly this, that you can look at the whole picture of the earnings distribution, not just the mean. The average earnings is interesting, and this is exactly why Oaxaca Blinder initially was very good to use. But I think we all know that earnings changes happen very differently across the whole earnings distribution. And Oaxaca Blinder allows us to look at, the RIF decomposition allows us to look at the whole earnings distribution. And we already saw in the Indian case that I've showed you, and it's also obvious in the other countries that we're looking at, I couldn't present all the other graphs, that looking at the distribution is very important, especially in this literature. Why? Because in the literature it says, it's not talking about average earnings, it's saying it depends on where you are in the occupational distribution. Are you medium skilled versus low skilled versus high skilled? So we have to understand the whole distribution. We can't look at the average of the distribution of earnings. So the RIF decomposition is a very nice way to look at that. And the other thing I like, which is why we used it, and I think there's a view many others will have who have been using RIF decompositions, is that it gives us actually fairly precise estimates of each covariate's contribution to changes in inequality, earnings inequality. That's really useful. So as I was showing to you, you can say, okay, the RTI has affected inequality versus education or some other worker characteristics in this part of the distribution in this way. That's pretty good. Of course, there are, we have to make some assumptions to get to that point, but I think this is very useful. And so I think that the way we use in our project is because of the very nice way it provides intuition behind the contribution of specific covariates to different parts of the distribution of the earnings distribution. Now, one thing I want to be also clear about is this is not causal, right? These are not causal. We're not doing causal identification here. So RIF is a descriptive method. There is a very useful descriptive method, and of course, there's always a question: is it the case RTI is causal explaining earnings distribution? Well, for that we need a different approach. We need causal identification methods, and maybe we can combine RIF decomposition with some causal identification methods. Maybe a difference in difference. Maybe approaching instrumental variables using IV analysis. That's up to you. How you take it forward is up to you. And so I just want to be clear that I don't think you should see the RIF decomposition as a causal analysis, because it's not. It's never meant to be, really, I don't think. Right? And so you need to then supplement the RIF decompositions with some causal analysis. And that's, of course, dependent on the exact policy experiment you're looking at in your specific country. Right? All right. Thanks. I hope I answered that question without getting the technicalities of the RIF, which is not that straightforward to explain in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think it's also very important if you want to look at policy recommendation, you look at not only the average, but looking at different parts of the distribution itself would give you a lot of knowledge, a lot of insight about the specific type of policies for different type of skills or jobs in that distribution. So I think that's very interesting. Although you had a word of caution that this is not actually causal inference, but yeah, I think it's something that it can be done complementary with the RIF decomposition. Okay, I have another question. I think there will be our last question because we're running out of time. This is from Professor Budirsa Sudarma. Thank you, Professor. Thanks for the nice presentation. How institutional differences among countries enter to this inequality stories? If you consider institutional differences among countries is important, particularly how this institutional aspect influence varies income within similar occupation and scale across countries. On different issues, how regional influences, distances to China or any growth center enter inequality story if you think location matters.
So so these are very good questions actually, and I think probably needs a very extended response, which I don't have the time, I think. But just on the institution, of course, it matters because perhaps one of the most important institutions in labor markets is minimum wages, right? Now, minimum wages, countries have different minimum wage regulations. Some countries pay high minimum wages, some countries pay low minimum wages, some countries provide minimum wage for some kind of occupations, but not others. Some countries provide minimum wage for all occupations. This is different. Now, so I think that you need to understand that exactly that the labor market, one major institution, I'm sure Indonesia has been very important, are minimum wage regulations, right? And we find in South Africa, for example, that has been a big factor behind why in South Africa the low-paid workers are protected because of minimum wages, right? Now, minimum wages in many other countries is not that well enforced, but in South Africa it was. Another important difference is public sector workers. As you know, public sector workers tend to be paid better than private sector workers, not always, but in many cases for the same skill distribution, let me put it that way. And if a country has a large public sector, then of course the role of the public sector in explaining the occupational wage distribution is very important. Where are those workers in the public sector? Are they the lower skilled jobs or the middle skilled jobs or the high level jobs? So Tunisia was a good example of the role of the public sector and how that changed over time. So there are, I would say, big institutions which differ across countries, which you need to understand. And therefore, it's very important when you're doing this country analysis to understand the institution in that country. Because if you don't, then there is a danger here that what you're inferring from looking at all the findings on RTI and so on might miss some very important variable, an omitted variable. And we were very careful in our country studies to look, and this is why we use country experts who knew their own countries, right? Now, on the question about location and closeness to China and so on, of course, we had China also in our case studies. And I think it's an interesting question. I think some of the countries in our study probably are closer to the technological frontier and closer also to the globalization than other countries. So if I compare China and India, China's had seen much higher amounts of robots being used in factories. Computerization is very much now prevalent in China in many jobs, not so much in India. So even in the 11 countries, I would say some of the countries are closer to the technological frontier, are globalizing very quickly, are using robots very much more. And of course, that has implications for looking at earnings distributions over time. Also, the links with the global value chains, the global production networks. China is, of course, preeminent in that. But if you look at African countries, they have not been as closely integrated with the global production networks. And we know what's happening in the global production networks. We're seeing this outsourcing of tasks, as I mentioned earlier, from richer countries to the poorer countries. So how exactly are you placed in the global production network, the global value chain, also has an implication on how much you might see increasing routine bias technological change. And these are questions which I think, our project we try to answer, but these are also very complex issues. And I think that's something that, we are still writing up our synthesis chapter for this work. But I think this is something we'll have to reflect on. The bigger, broader trends happening as we look at each country experience.
All right. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we're running out of time. We're like 5 minutes off of the schedule. I would like to thank Professor Kunal Sen for the talk today. It's a lot. I mean, I think we learned a lot of things from you. Thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So, dear participants, conference participants, I think that's the end of our keynote session today. I hope you enjoy the session. I hope you learned a lot from Professor Sen. I wish you a more enjoyable second day of conference. Thank you so much for joining us, and please forgive me if I said something wrong or anything that make you unhappy. So that's all. I would. Should I hand back the session to Pak Gumilang or Bu Evi? No? Or I should just close the session? All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Professor Sen. Thank you, Mbak Sekar.